A billionaire steps outside his office and finds a shivering little girl wrapped in his stolen jacket. He has no idea she's about to change his life forever. The rain had just stopped when Nathan Reed stepped out of the revolving doors of his corporate headquarters. The pavement glistened under the orange streetlights, and the cool evening air carried the faint scent of wet asphalt and exhaust. It had been another endless day filled with board meetings, investor calls, and decisions that affected millions of dollars, but none of which truly meant anything to him anymore. He loosened his tie, checked his watch, and started toward his car, parked by the curb where his driver was waiting. The city hummed around him in a rhythm he no longer noticed. But then something unusual caught his attention, a small figure sitting motionless near the steps of the building, pressed up against the marble wall as if trying to disappear into it. At first, he thought it was someone waiting for a parent or a lost assistant trying to escape the rain. But as he got closer, he realized it was a little girl, maybe 5 or 6 years old, sitting on the cold ground with her knees pulled up to her chest. She was wrapped in something oversized and blue. His eyes narrowed, and recognition struck. It was his company's jacket, the kind issued only to senior staff, embroidered with the logo of Reed Industries. The jacket was far too big for her, it draped over her shoulders and pooled around her like a blanket. Her blonde hair stuck to her cheeks, damp from the drizzle, and her small hands clutched the fabric as if it were the only thing keeping her warm. Her eyes, bright blue and startlingly clear, lifted to meet his, and for a moment, Nathan froze. There was something hauntingly familiar about the way she looked at him, not with fear, but with a kind of weary resignation, as though she had already seen too much of the world for someone so young. He cleared his throat, trying to sound calm, though something about the situation unsettled him. "Hey," he said, keeping his voice low, "what are you doing here? That jacket, where did you get it?" The girl looked down for a second, her voice barely audible when she answered. "I took it." The honesty in her tone was almost disarming. "You stole it?" he asked, more curious than angry. She nodded slowly, still staring at the ground. "Why?" he pressed, unsure why he even cared. After a pause, she whispered, "Because it smells like home." Nathan's mind went blank for a moment. Of all the explanations he could have imagined, that one pierced him straight through. He looked at her again, small, pale, trembling from the cold but holding on to the jacket like it was a lifeline. She wasn't dirty or unkempt in the way children living on the streets often were, but there was a fragility about her that spoke of long days without care, of being invisible to the world. People passed by, glancing curiously, but no one stopped. He crouched down to her level, the expensive fabric of his suit brushing against the wet ground. "What's your name?" he asked gently. "Lily," she said after a long moment, her lips forming the word like it was a secret. "Where are your parents, Lily?" he asked. Her small shoulders lifted in a shrug. "Don't have any," she said simply, without emotion, as if she had already told the story too many times. Nathan exhaled slowly, trying to think. He was not a man accustomed to uncertainty. His life was built on logic, on cause and effect, on control. But nothing in his years of managing people, markets, and crises prepared him for a child sitting barefoot outside his office wearing his jacket and claiming to have no home. His driver approached from the car, holding an umbrella. "Sir, everything all right?" Nathan glanced up, then back at the girl. "Call the police," he said quietly, and immediately regretted it when he saw Lily's eyes widen in fear. "No, please don't," she said quickly, pulling the jacket tighter around herself. Her voice cracked. "They'll take me back." "Back where?" he asked, but she just shook her head. A lump formed in his throat, something heavy and unfamiliar. He wasn't sure why her words hit him so hard. Maybe because he knew what it felt like to want to go back somewhere that no longer existed. He sighed and rubbed the back of his neck, realizing he couldn't just walk away. "Okay," he said softly, his tone shifting. "No police. But you can't stay out here, it's cold." She looked at him warily, her blue eyes searching his face as if trying to decide whether to trust him. Finally, She nodded. He offered his hand, but she didn't take it. Instead, she stood on her own and followed him toward the car. The jacket dragged behind her as she walked, making her look even smaller. When they reached the car, the driver hesitated. "Sir, are we taking her somewhere?" Nathan hesitated for only a second. "Yes," he said. "Somewhere warm." The car ride was silent except for the hum of the city. Lily stared out the window, her reflection ghost-like against the glass. Nathan studied her in the dim light, noting the way her hands trembled slightly and how she blinked too often, as though holding back tears. "So," he said finally, trying to sound casual, "you took that jacket from my building?" She nodded. "Why my jacket?" She hesitated, then said, "It was hanging on a chair. I liked the color. And it smelled like someone who wouldn't leave." He turned his head toward her, startled. "Someone who wouldn't leave?" She nodded again, her gaze still fixed on the window. "Everyone leaves. But not whoever wore this." When they arrived at the small cafe near his office, he told the driver to wait and led her inside. The warmth and smell of coffee filled the air, and the waitress gave them a curious look but said nothing. He ordered hot chocolate for her and coffee for himself. When the drink came, Lily wrapped both hands around the cup, closing her eyes as she felt the heat seep into her fingers. For the first time that evening, she smiled, a small, fleeting thing, but real. He didn't know why he stayed sitting there, watching her sip her drink in silence. Maybe because for the first time in years, he wasn't thinking about numbers or deadlines. Maybe because her presence filled something in him he didn't know was empty. She looked up after a while and said quietly, "Are you gonna take your jacket back?" He shook his head. "No," he said. "You keep it." She blinked, surprised. "Really?" "Really," he said. "But you have to promise to stay warm." Her smile widened just a little, and he felt something stir in his chest that he hadn't felt since he lost his wife years ago, something like warmth, something like purpose. As they drove her to a nearby shelter later that night, he told himself it was the right thing to do, that he couldn't get involved beyond this. But when he dropped her off and saw her turn back at the door, clutching his jacket as she whispered, "Thank you," he knew he would see her again. Nathan Reed had made countless decisions in his life, but none as small, or as life-changing, as stopping for one lonely child in the rain. He didn't know it yet, but that moment outside his office would unravel everything he thought he knew about control, success, and the meaning of home. Nathan didn't sleep that night. He kept thinking about the little girl in the blue jacket, about how small she looked sitting on that cold floor, about her quiet voice when she said it smelled like home. It shouldn't have mattered, people came and went from his life all the time, and he had long ago learned to distance himself from anything emotional. Yet for some reason, every time he closed his eyes, he saw those bright blue eyes staring back at him. At one point, he even caught himself walking to the closet where his spare suit jackets were hanging, staring at the row of identical light blue blazers that bore the company's insignia, wondering which one had been the one she took. He felt ridiculous for caring, but there was no denying it anymore, something about that girl had shaken him. The next morning, instead of going straight to the office, he told his driver to take a detour. He didn't even know why he said it, but the words came out before he could stop himself. The city shelter. The one near East 47th, the driver glanced at him in the rearview mirror, slightly surprised but obedient as always. When they arrived, the building looked even grimmer in daylight. The bricks were faded, the windows clouded, and the sign over the entrance had half its letters missing. Inside, the fluorescent lights buzzed faintly, and the smell of disinfectant was so strong it made him wince. The woman at the reception desk looked up in confusion as he approached, clearly recognizing him from the news. "Mr. Reed," she said hesitantly. "Is there a problem?" He shook his head quickly. "I came to check on someone. A little girl. Her name's Lily." The woman's expression softened. "She's quiet. Doesn't talk much. But she's Different when she's with you. Nathan felt a strange ache in his chest as she said it. May I see her? He asked. Just for a few minutes. The woman nodded and disappeared down a hallway. A few minutes later, small footsteps echoed on the tiled floor. Lily appeared, clutching the same jacket, her hair still a bit tangled, her expression uncertain until she saw him. Then something bright lit up her face, something fragile and real. You came back, she said softly. I told them you would. He crouched down to her level again, unsure what to say. You remembered me, he said finally. She nodded seriously. People forget. But I knew you wouldn't. The simplicity of her faith in him hit him harder than he expected. You shouldn't be so sure about that, he said with a faint smile. I'm not a very good person. She tilted her head slightly, as if studying him. You brought me hot chocolate, she said. Good people do that. He almost laughed, but the sound died before it could leave his throat. How long had it been since anyone had spoken to him without wanting something? He took her to a small cafe again that morning. The waitress remembered them from the night before and smiled as they sat down in the same booth by the window. The rain had stopped, and sunlight streamed through the glass, catching the golden strands in Lily's hair. She ordered pancakes this time, her small hands gripping the fork clumsily, her legs swinging beneath the chair. He watched her eat in silence, realizing how strange and natural it felt at the same time. So, he said finally, you've been staying at the shelter for a while. She nodded. Since the lady at the house said I couldn't stay anymore. What lady? The one who let me sleep in her basement, she said matter-of-factly. She said I was too old now. Nathan frowned. Too old. She only liked small ones, Lily said simply, then went back to eating. His stomach turned. He didn't ask any more questions. After breakfast, he took her to the park nearby. The grass was still wet, and the air smelled of earth and new leaves. Lily ran ahead, laughing as she chased a pigeon, and for the first time in what felt like years, Nathan found himself smiling without meaning to. She tripped, fell, then looked back at him and laughed harder. He hadn't realized how much he missed the sound of laughter. When she finally grew tired, she sat beside him on a bench and leaned against his arm without asking. He froze for a moment, every muscle stiff, then slowly relaxed. She was so light, so small, and yet she felt like an anchor keeping him from drifting back into the emptiness he'd been living in for so long. When it was time to take her back, she didn't protest. She just looked up at him and said, "You'll come tomorrow?" He hesitated, then nodded. Yes, tomorrow. As he walked away, he glanced back once and saw her standing in the doorway, still holding his jacket, watching him until he disappeared around the corner. That night, he sat in his office long after everyone else had gone home. The city lights blinked beyond the glass walls, and his reflection stared back at him, sharp suit, tired eyes, a man who had everything and yet nothing that mattered. On his desk lay a contract worth millions, and signed. Instead of reading it, he opened his phone and looked up the nearest legal requirements for guardianship. The thought startled him, and he immediately closed the page. It was absurd. He didn't even know this girl. She was a stranger. A child. And yet, as he leaned back in his chair, he could still hear her voice saying, "You came back. I told them you would." He poured himself a glass of whiskey and stood by the window, watching the rain start to fall again. The city below shimmered in the wet light, alive and distant. For years, he had believed that nothing could reach him anymore, that his heart was locked behind layers of armor built from success, control, and solitude. But somewhere out there, a little girl was sleeping in his jacket, believing he would come back. And that belief, fragile as it was, had found a crack in the armor. He didn't know what it meant yet, but he knew one thing with startling clarity: he would go back. Not out of pity or guilt, but because for the first time in a very long time, someone had looked at him as if he still had something left to give. The next morning, Nathan woke up before sunrise, something he hadn't done in years. The city outside his window was still half asleep, the streets wet and silver in the early light. He stood there for a long time, staring at the skyline that had once made him feel powerful but now just felt empty. Somewhere out there, a little girl was waking up in a shelter, clutching a jacket that didn't belong to her, and that thought wouldn't leave him alone. He showered, dressed, and skipped his usual breakfast meeting. His assistant called twice, asking about the contracts he hadn't signed, but he ignored her. All that mattered this morning was finding out more about Lily. When he arrived at the shelter, the woman at the desk greeted him with a knowing look. "You again," she said, but her tone wasn't unkind. "She's been asking for you." He felt something tighten in his chest at those words. The woman led him down a narrow hallway that smelled faintly of soap and dust. The walls were covered in children's drawings, bright colors and smiling suns, none of which felt real. At the end of the hall, sitting cross-legged on a thin rug, was Lily. She was holding a crumpled piece of paper and a half-broken pencil, drawing something he couldn't see. When she looked up and saw him, her whole face changed. "You came," she said, standing up quickly. "I told them you would." He smiled, though he felt strangely unsteady. "I said I would, didn't I?" She ran up to him and tugged gently on his sleeve, showing him the paper. It was a drawing of a house with two stick figures in front, one tall and one small. He didn't need to ask who they were supposed to be. "That's you and me," she explained proudly. "You look taller in real life." He chuckled quietly, feeling something inside him shift. "You think so?" She said, then frowned. "But you look sad." He blinked at her, caught off guard. "Sad?" "In your eyes," she said simply. "Like the sky before it rains." He didn't know what to say to that. Adults hadn't been able to read him for years, but this child did it without even trying. "Maybe I'm just tired," he said finally. She studied him for a moment longer, then nodded, as if she didn't believe him but was willing to let it go. He took her out again that day, despite the curious glances from the staff. They walked through Central Park, where the trees were bare and the wind sharp but clean. Lily talked almost the entire time, about birds, about colors, about a dream she had where she lived in a house that smelled like pancakes. He listened more than he spoke, surprised by how easily her chatter filled the quiet that used to feel unbearable. Every so often she would grab his hand without thinking, and every time she did, it startled him how natural it felt. When they stopped by a small pond, she bent down to pick up a pebble and tossed it into the water. "Do you have a daughter?" she asked suddenly, not looking at him. The question struck him like a punch to the gut. "No," he said after a pause. "I used to have one," he almost added, but the words wouldn't come. The silence that followed felt heavier than the cold air around them. She looked up, sensing something she didn't understand. "It's okay," she said softly. "You can borrow me if you want." He laughed, though it came out broken. "Borrow you?" "Just until you're not sad anymore," she said, throwing another stone. "Then you can give me back." The rest of the day passed in a blur. He took her to a bookstore, where she ran her fingers along the shelves and picked out a children's story about a lost kitten. When he offered to buy it for her, she shook her head. "Can you just read it to me instead?" she asked. And so, in a quiet corner of the store, surrounded by strangers pretending not to stare, Nathan Reed, billionaire and CEO, sat on the floor with a 6-year-old orphan and read aloud about a kitten finding its way home. That night, when he returned to his apartment, everything felt wrong. The rooms were too big, too silent, too sterile. He opened his laptop, tried to review his schedule for the next day, but the words blurred. He got up, poured himself a glass of water, and caught sight of his reflection in the window, immaculate suit, perfect tie, and eyes that looked exactly the way Lily had described. Like the sky before it rains. He leaned his forehead against the glass and exhaled. The next few days followed the same rhythm. He worked half-heartedly in the mornings, then drove to the shelter in the afternoons. He told himself it was just temporary, that he was making sure she was taken care of, but deep down he knew it wasn't about that. He needed to see her. She had become a kind of gravity, pulling him back to something he didn't know he'd lost. The staff began to smile knowingly whenever he showed up, and one evening the woman at the front desk said, "You know, she sleeps with that jacket every night. Won't let anyone wash it. Says it's magic." He didn't answer, but his throat felt tight. One evening, after reading her a story before bedtime, he lingered a little too long in the doorway. She was already half asleep, curled up under a thin blanket, her fingers clutching the fabric of the jacket near her face. "Good night, Lily," he whispered. Her eyes opened briefly, and she murmured, "Good night, Daddy," before drifting back to sleep. The word hit him so hard he had to grab the doorframe to steady himself. She hadn't meant it, not really, it was just something children said when they felt safe. But for him, it cracked something open inside that he had buried years ago. He walked out into the cold night air, his breath visible in the streetlights, and for the first time in years, he felt tears threaten. He didn't cry when he buried his wife. He didn't cry when he lost his daughter. But now, standing outside a shelter with a little girl asleep inside, he felt everything he'd been running from pressing down on him all at once. He looked up at the sky, gray and endless, and whispered to no one, "Maybe I needed you more than you needed me." He didn't know what he was going to do next, but one thing was already certain. He couldn't walk away again. The following weeks blurred together in a rhythm Nathan hadn't expected his life to take. Mornings were still filled with meetings, phone calls, and business decisions, but they no longer carried the same urgency. Every day, no matter how packed his schedule was, he found himself glancing at the clock around 3 in the afternoon, feeling an unspoken pull toward the shelter. By now, everyone in his company noticed something had changed. The once cold and commanding CEO had begun missing after-hours meetings, ignoring social events, and smiling, a rare thing, something people whispered about behind his back because no one could quite believe it. But Nathan didn't care. He had stopped explaining himself a long time ago. Lily had become part of his world in ways he hadn't realized were possible. He visited her daily, sometimes bringing small gifts, a book, a sketchpad, or even a jar of cookies. Other times, he brought nothing but his presence, which she seemed to value more than anything else. She was brighter now, more talkative, her laughter less cautious. The staff said she had started helping younger children, comforting them when they cried or sharing her food with them. "She's different when you're around," one of the caregivers told him. "It's like she believes everything is going to be okay as long as you're here." Those words stayed with him, echoing in his head long after he left. One afternoon, as he sat with her by the shelter's small window, watching the rain streak down the glass, she turned to him and asked, "Do you have a family?" The question caught him off guard. He hesitated before answering, trying to decide how much truth she could handle. "I did," he said quietly. "A long time ago." She nodded slowly, sensing the weight behind the words but not pressing for details. "I think they miss you," she said simply, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. He swallowed hard and smiled faintly. "Maybe they do. You should tell them you miss them too," she added, "because if you don't, they get lonely in heaven." He didn't respond. He couldn't. That night, the memories he had tried to bury for years returned like ghosts refusing to stay quiet. He dreamed of the accident again, the screeching tires, the sound of shattering glass, the flash of white that swallowed everything. He woke up drenched in sweat, his heart pounding, his throat tight with the scream he hadn't let out. It had been 10 years, but the pain hadn't dulled. His wife, Claire, and their little girl, Emily, had been driving home from a birthday party when another car ran a red light. He had been on a conference call, too busy to answer when Claire tried to call him moments before the crash. The police said they died instantly, but Nathan never stopped hearing the unanswered ring in his head. He buried himself in work, convinced that building an empire would fill the void. But it hadn't. Nothing had. Until Lily. He started noticing how much she reminded him of Emily. Not in appearance, Emily had dark curls and brown eyes, but in the small gestures. The way Lily tilted her head when she was curious, how she hummed to herself when she colored, how she would lean against his arm when she felt safe. It terrified him at first, the idea that he could care this much again, that he could let someone this small and fragile back into the spaces of his heart that had long been locked away. But every time he thought of walking away, he remembered that night when she had whispered, "Good night, Daddy," and the idea of never hearing her voice again made him feel like he couldn't breathe. One day, as he was leaving the office, his assistant stopped him. "Sir, you have an interview request from Forbes," she said. "They want to feature you for their Leaders of Tomorrow segment." He waved it off. "Not interested." She looked stunned. "But, sir, this is a major opportunity." "I said no," he repeated, sharper than he meant to. The truth was, he didn't want to be the face of ambition anymore. He was starting to see how hollow that version of himself had been. Success had given him everything except peace. And the only time he felt something close to peace now was when Lily smiled at him. But peace, he was about to learn, never came without a storm. The first sign of trouble came as a phone call late one evening. The shelter's director was on the line, her voice trembling. "Mr. Reed, I'm afraid there's a problem. Someone from the state's child welfare department came by today. They're investigating Lily's case. Apparently, someone filed a report questioning why she's been spending so much time with you." Nathan felt his blood run cold. "A report? From who?" "We don't know," she said. "But they're asking questions about you. They think you might be trying to adopt her unofficially. They're threatening to move her to another facility until things are sorted." For a long moment, Nathan couldn't speak. He stared out at the dark city skyline, feeling the world tilt beneath him. "They can't just take her away," he said finally, his voice low but steady. "She's safe there. She's happy." "I know," the woman said softly. "But rules are rules. I'm sorry." That night, Nathan drove to the shelter. It was late, the streets nearly empty, the building dimly lit. Lily was already asleep, her small body curled up under the same thin blanket, the blue jacket still draped over her shoulders. He sat beside her bed for a long time, just watching her breathe, memorizing every detail of her face. She stirred once and reached out instinctively, her hand brushing against his. "You came," she murmured without opening her eyes. "You always come." He swallowed hard, brushing a strand of hair from her forehead. "Always," he whispered. He didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but in that moment, he made himself a silent promise. He would not lose another child. He would fight whoever he had to, defy whatever rules stood in his way. He had spent 10 years running from grief, but now, for the first time, he had something worth fighting for again. When he finally left the shelter, the air outside was freezing, the wind biting against his skin. He looked up at the city skyline, his kingdom of glass and steel, and realized that all the power in the world meant nothing if he couldn't protect the one person who had reminded him how to feel human again. The next morning, Nathan walked into his office earlier than usual. The city was still waking up, but his mind was already spinning. The phone call from the shelter kept replaying in his head. The thought of losing Lily made something inside him tighten, a mix of fear and anger he hadn't felt since the day he buried his family. He had promised himself never to get attached again, but that promise had already been broken. He called his legal team before his assistant even arrived. "I need you to find out everything about child welfare regulations, guardianship procedures, and foster care laws," he said as soon as one of his attorneys picked up. "And I mean everything." The lawyer hesitated before asking, "Mr. Reed, may I ask why?" Nathan's tone was cold but controlled. Because someone's trying to take away the only good thing that's happened to me in years. There was silence on the other end before the lawyer said quietly, "Understood, sir." By the time his assistant came in with his schedule, he had already cleared the day. He drove to the shelter himself, ignoring calls and messages that piled up on his phone. When he arrived, the atmosphere felt heavier than usual. The woman at the front desk looked uneasy. "Mr. Reed, they came again," she said. "They said they'll be transferring Lily to another facility by the end of the week." His stomach dropped. "Where?" "They didn't say, only that it's more appropriate given her exposure to the media." He frowned. "Media? What media?" The woman sighed and slid a newspaper across the desk. On the front page was a photo of him leaving the shelter a few days earlier, Lily holding his hand, smiling up at him. The headline read, "Billionaire CEO spotted visiting orphan daily, secret daughter or charity stunt." Nathan felt the blood drain from his face. "Who leaked this?" he demanded. "Probably one of the volunteers," the woman said. "They don't understand how careful we have to be." He dropped the paper on the counter, jaw tightening. "They think I'm doing this for attention," he muttered. "They think she's some kind of headline." He turned away before his temper could explode. "Where is she now?" "In the playroom," the woman said softly. "But Mr. Reed, please be careful. Anything you say or do now can affect her case." He walked down the hall, each step heavier than the last. When he entered the room, Lily was sitting on the floor with a group of children, stacking colored blocks. When she saw him, her face lit up the way it always did, and for a moment, the world outside ceased to exist. "You came," she said, grinning. "You said you would." He forced a smile, kneeling beside her. "I'll always come," he said, then glanced at the caregiver standing nearby, watching them cautiously. He lowered his voice. "Hey, Lily, how would you feel if we went somewhere new? Somewhere better?" She blinked. "Like a new home?" He nodded. "Maybe," he said carefully. "Would you want that?" She tilted her head, thinking. "Only if you come too." Those words broke him in ways he didn't show. He brushed her hair back gently, forcing another smile. "We'll figure it out, okay?" She nodded, then handed him one of the blocks. "Then help me build," she said, and he did. For an hour they sat there, building towers that fell and rebuilding them again, pretending the world outside that small room wasn't trying to tear them apart. That night, back in his penthouse, Nathan sat in the dark with a glass of whiskey untouched on the table. The city glowed outside his window, its light as cold and distant as ever. He thought of Lily's face, her laughter, the way she said "you always come." He thought of all the times he hadn't come for the people he loved. He remembered Claire calling him the night of the accident, how he'd silenced the phone because he was in a meeting that couldn't wait. He remembered the police officer's expression when he arrived at the hospital, too late. And he remembered how, for 10 years, he had drowned himself in work, convinced that staying busy meant staying numb. But Lily had changed that. She had reminded him that some things were worth feeling again, even if they hurt. The next day, his lawyers delivered a report. The news wasn't good. "Legally, you don't have much standing," one of them said. "You're not a relative, and you don't have guardianship rights. If the state decides to relocate her, you can't stop it unless you apply for foster status or full adoption, and even then, the process takes months." Nathan rubbed his temples, exhaling sharply. "Then start the process," he said. "Now." The lawyer hesitated. "Are you sure, sir? It's not simple. It will attract attention, especially given your public profile." Nathan looked up, his eyes cold. "I've been living under a spotlight my entire life. Let them watch." In the following days, reporters camped outside his building. Headlines multiplied, speculations ran wild, and the board of his company grew restless. His investors began calling, warning him that his reputation was on the line. "Nathan, you need to distance yourself from this," one of them urged over the phone. "You're making emotional decisions. This could ruin your credibility." Nathan's voice was calm but sharp. "If credibility means standing by while a child gets tossed around like a file folder, then I don't want it." He hung up without waiting for a response. Meanwhile, Lily was moved into temporary custody, and the shelter stopped allowing visitors while the investigation continued. Nathan showed up anyway, only to be turned away by a guard at the gate. "I'm sorry, sir," the man said, clearly uncomfortable. "We can't let anyone in without state authorization." Nathan's hand curled into a fist, but he said nothing. He stood there for a long time, staring at the building that now felt like a prison. He wanted to break down the door, to shout that he could take better care of her than any system ever could. But instead, he walked away quietly, his coat billowing in the wind, his expression carved from stone. That night, he couldn't focus on anything. The walls of his apartment seemed to close in on him. Every sound, the hum of the refrigerator, the distant siren, the ticking of the clock, felt unbearable. He got up, grabbed his keys, and drove aimlessly through the city until he found himself parked in front of the shelter again. The lights inside were off except for one small glow in an upstairs window. He stared at it, wondering if that was her room. For a moment, he thought he saw a small silhouette move behind the curtain. Maybe it was his imagination, or maybe it really was Lily looking out into the night, waiting for him to come. He rolled down the window and whispered, "I'm here, Lily. I'm not going anywhere." He stayed there for hours, long after the streets went quiet. When dawn began to break, painting the sky in shades of gray and pink, Nathan made a silent vow to himself. No matter how long it took, no matter what it cost, he would bring her home. Not because he needed redemption, though maybe he did, but because for the first time in 10 years, he finally understood what it meant to love someone more than his own pride, his company, or his comfort. And that was something he wasn't willing to lose again. By the time Nathan began the adoption process, his entire world had shifted into chaos. The story about the billionaire and the orphan girl had become a sensation online, filling headlines and gossip shows. Some called him a hero, a man rediscovering his humanity after tragedy. Others painted him as manipulative, claiming it was a publicity stunt meant to soften his image after his company's ruthless business record. He didn't care what they said, but he cared about what it was doing to Lily. When he visited her for the first supervised meeting after a week of separation, he noticed the difference immediately. Her shoulders were tense, her eyes guarded. She was no longer the bright, laughing child who had waited by the window every day. When she saw him, she ran to him but stopped halfway, glancing uncertainly at the social worker standing nearby. "Can I?" she asked. The woman nodded. Then Lily threw herself into his arms, and for the first time in days, he felt like he could breathe again. He held her for a long moment, afraid that if he let go, she might vanish again. "You're okay," he whispered, trying to convince himself as much as her. "I missed you, sweetheart." She looked up at him and said softly, "They said you're in trouble." "Who said that?" he asked. "The lady with the papers," she replied. "She said maybe you can't be my family because you're too busy." Nathan's chest tightened. He wanted to tell her that he would give up every meeting, every deal, every piece of his empire if that's what it took to keep her safe. Instead, he brushed her hair back and smiled. "They don't know me very well, do they?" The legal process dragged on for weeks. Every day brought a new obstacle: background checks, financial audits, interviews with psychologists. Nathan had built skyscrapers faster than the government could process a single piece of adoption paperwork. His lawyers warned him that his status might work against him. "They don't trust people like you," one of them said bluntly. "They think you're trying to buy what can't be bought." Nathan sighed. "Then I'll show them money has nothing to do with it." The irony of that statement wasn't lost on him. For most of his life, everything he touched had a price tag. But not this. Not her. The press followed him everywhere. Cameras waited outside the courthouse, flashing as soon as he stepped out of his car. His PR team begged him to make a statement to control the narrative, but Nathan refused. "I'm not turning her life into entertainment," he said. "Let them talk." What he didn't say out loud was that every article, every rumor, might reach Lily someday, and the thought of her reading something cruel terrified him. One night, after a particularly long day of depositions, he returned home to find an envelope waiting at his door. It had no name, no address, just a simple folded piece of paper inside. The handwriting was uneven, clearly done by a child. "I'm scared they'll take me away forever. Please don't let them." There was a tiny drawing below it, a stick figure of him holding hands with her, both of them smiling under a blue sky. He sat down heavily on the couch, the letter trembling in his hands. For a man who had once negotiated billion-dollar contracts without blinking, it was the first time in years that he felt truly powerless. The next morning, he called his assistant and cancelled every meeting indefinitely. "From now on, the company runs without me," he said. "Tell the board I'll be back when I'm done fighting for something that actually matters." She hesitated, then asked quietly, "Are you sure?" He looked at her and said, "I've never been more sure of anything in my life." A week later, the hearing took place. The courtroom was sterile, filled with the low hum of whispered speculation from reporters seated in the back. The judge, a gray-haired woman with a stern but not unkind face, looked down at the file in front of her. "Mr. Reed," she began, "you are aware that this case has become highly publicized. Do you believe your fame, or infamy, depending on perspective, will allow you to give this child a normal life?" Nathan stood straight, his voice calm but full of conviction. "I don't want to give her a normal life, Your Honor. I want to give her a safe one. A real one. One where she knows that she matters more than anything else." The judge studied him for a long moment, then turned to Lily, who sat beside her guardian. "Lily," she said gently, "do you understand what's happening today?" Lily nodded solemnly. "They're deciding if I can stay." "And who do you want to stay with?" the judge asked. Lily turned to look at Nathan, her small face serious. "With him," she said. "He keeps his promises." The room went silent. For a few seconds, even the reporters seemed unsure if they should breathe. The judge's expression softened slightly. "That's a strong thing to say," she murmured. "Are you sure?" "Yes," Lily said, with a steadiness that made Nathan's throat tighten. "Everyone else says things and leaves. But he always comes back." The decision didn't come that day, but Nathan knew something had changed. The system might be slow, but it couldn't ignore what was real. Over the next few weeks, he met with more officials, attended evaluations, even agreed to home inspections that felt like invasions of privacy. Yet every time he wanted to give up, he remembered the little note she had written and the sound of her voice in the courtroom. One evening, as he was driving home after yet another meeting, his phone rang. The caller ID showed the shelter's number. His stomach lurched as he answered. "Mr. Reed?" It was the director's voice, and she sounded shaken. "There's been an accident. The building caught fire. Most of the children are safe, but they can't find Lily." For a second, everything stopped. The road blurred in front of him, and his breath caught in his throat. "What do you mean they can't find her?" he demanded, already turning the car around. "She was in her room. The firefighters are searching," but he didn't wait for her to finish. By the time he reached the shelter, flames were already licking at the roof, the air thick with smoke and sirens. Firefighters were shouting orders, parents were crying, chaos reigned. He pushed past the crowd, ignoring the people calling his name, and ran toward the building. A firefighter grabbed his arm. "Sir, you can't go in there." Nathan shoved him off. "There's a little girl inside, her name is Lily." The man shouted something, but Nathan was already moving, his mind empty except for one thought, not again. I'm not losing her too, The heat was suffocating, smoke burning his lungs, but he kept going. He shouted her name over and over, his voice hoarse and desperate. Then, faintly, he heard it, a weak, trembling cry from somewhere near the stairs. He found her crouched beneath a desk, clutching his jacket to her chest, tears streaking her soot-covered face. "Daddy," she whispered when she saw him. The word cut through the chaos like a lifeline. He lifted her into his arms, wrapping the jacket around her, and carried her through the smoke. The world around him blurred, a swirl of fire and fear, but he didn't stop until he burst through the front doors, gasping for air. The crowd erupted as firefighters rushed forward, spraying water over them both. Lily clung to him, coughing, trembling, but alive. Nathan sank to his knees on the pavement, holding her close as the medics surrounded them. Cameras flashed somewhere in the background, but he didn't see them. All he could do was whisper, "It's okay, you're safe. I've got you." That night, when the hospital confirmed that Lily would recover, Nathan sat beside her bed, his hands still trembling. For years, he had believed that loss was inevitable, that love always came with destruction. But now, as he watched her sleep with his jacket still wrapped around her small body, he realized something else: love wasn't what destroyed him. It was what had saved him. The days after the fire were a blur of noise, light, and exhaustion. Nathan barely left Lily's side in the hospital. Machines beeped quietly around her, the faint smell of antiseptic clinging to everything. The first night, she had nightmares, her small body trembling as she mumbled for him not to leave her. Each time she stirred, he was there, his hand wrapped around hers, whispering that she was safe. The doctors said she was lucky: smoke inhalation, minor burns, a few scrapes, but nothing that wouldn't heal. Nathan knew better. The real wounds weren't the ones on her skin. They were deeper, the kind that came from knowing the world could fall apart in a single night. He recognized that feeling too well. The hospital staff whispered about them constantly. The millionaire who had run into a burning building for a little girl. The man who had almost died saving someone who wasn't even his. Reporters camped outside, their cameras ready, but Nathan didn't give them what they wanted. He ignored every question, every request for an interview. The only words that mattered now were the ones he said to her each morning when she woke up: "You're okay. You're safe. I'm here." After a few days, she began to smile again. It was faint, tired, but real. One morning, she turned her head toward him and said softly, "You didn't leave me." He looked at her and said, "Never." Her fingers tightened around his. "They said my home is gone," she murmured. "Does that mean I don't have one now?" He swallowed hard before answering. "No, sweetheart. It means we'll find a new one. Together." Her eyes lit up at that word, and he knew there was no turning back. When the time came for her discharge, a social worker arrived, her face polite but tense. "Mr. Reed," she began, "first, let me say we're grateful for what you did. You saved her life. But we need to discuss next steps." Nathan's jaw tightened. "I've already submitted the adoption petition." "I know," she said carefully. "But in light of the recent events and the media attention, the agency is concerned about stability. They want to ensure she'll have a quiet, structured life. Perhaps it would be better if she was placed temporarily." "No," he interrupted. His voice was calm, but there was steel behind it. "She's been moved enough. She's staying with me." The woman hesitated. "Mr. Reed, this isn't how the system works." He met her gaze, his blue eyes hard as glass. "Then the system needs to change." In the days that followed, he prepared his home for her arrival. The penthouse, once cold and impersonal, began to transform. He cleared out an entire room and filled it with soft colors, toys, and books. He replaced the modern furniture with something warmer, less perfect. He even hung her drawing, the one she had sent him, the two stick figures holding hands, on the wall above her bed. For the first time, his house felt alive. When Lily arrived, she stood in the doorway of her new room, her eyes wide. "It's all mine," she whispered. "All yours," he said. She ran her small fingers across the dresser, the curtains, the stuffed animals lined neatly on the bed. "It smells like you," she said quietly, smiling. "Then it smells like home," he replied. But peace didn't come easily. The world outside didn't let them forget who they were. Reporters followed them to the park, cameras hiding behind trees, hoping to capture a picture of the miracle girl and her unlikely savior. Some articles called him a saint. Others accused him of exploiting tragedy to polish his image. Nathan ignored it all, but he couldn't shield Lily from the whispers forever. Once, when a journalist shouted across the street, "Is she your daughter or your charity case?" he saw Lily flinch. That night, as he tucked her into bed, she asked in a small voice, "Why do people say mean things about you?" He sighed, brushing her hair away from her forehead. "Because they don't understand," he said. "But that's okay. We know the truth." She looked at him for a long time before whispering, "You're my dad, right?" His throat tightened, but he nodded. "Yeah. I am." She smiled and closed her eyes, falling asleep before he could say anything else. Weeks passed, and for a while, it felt like they had found their rhythm. He learned how to pack lunches, how to braid hair badly, how to read bedtime stories with voices that made her giggle. She learned that sometimes he woke up in the middle of the night from dreams he wouldn't talk about, and she would quietly bring her blanket to his bed and fall asleep beside him. They both began to heal in ways neither of them could explain. But the world wasn't done testing them yet. One afternoon, Nathan received a letter from the adoption agency. His application had been delayed again. The reasons were wrapped in polite language: public scrutiny, questions of emotional readiness, concerns about the influence of wealth, but underneath, it was clear, they didn't trust him. That night, after putting Lily to bed, he sat in his study staring at the letter. Anger burned in his chest, but beneath it was fear. What if they never let him keep her? What if she was taken away again? He ran his hands over his face, exhausted. The thought of losing her now was unbearable. He had lost too much already. As he sat there, he heard the soft patter of small feet behind him. Lily stood in the doorway, rubbing her eyes, holding her teddy bear. "You're sad again," she said sleepily. He forced a smile. "Just thinking." She walked over to him and climbed onto his lap without asking, curling up against his chest. "You don't have to think so much," she murmured. "You already found me." He laughed quietly, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. "You're right," he said. "I did." The next day, he made a decision. He called his lawyers and told them to move everything faster, no matter the cost. He sold one of his properties to fund the creation of a new foundation for orphaned and displaced children, naming it the Lily Project. It wasn't just a gesture, it was a declaration. He would make sure no other child had to go through what she did. Within weeks, the project gained public attention, this time for all the right reasons. The headlines shifted from scandal to admiration. The world finally began to see what he was trying to do. When the adoption finally went through, it was almost anticlimactic. The same judge who had seen them months before smiled as she signed the papers. "Mr. Reed," she said, "it seems she was already your daughter long before this was official." Nathan's throat tightened as he looked down at Lily, who was grinning up at him, holding his hand. "You ready to go home?" he asked her. She nodded enthusiastically. "Home," she repeated, as if tasting the word for the first time. That night, as they stood on the balcony of his apartment, the city spread out before them in a sea of lights, she leaned her head against his arm and said quietly, "Do you still miss them? Your family?" He took a deep breath. "Every day," he said. But I think they'd be happy now. Because I finally stopped running. She reached up, placing her small hand over his heart. You didn't stop. You just came home. He turned his head, looking down at her, and for the first time in a decade, the ache in his chest eased. The city lights flickered below, the night air cool against their faces, and Nathan realized that this quiet, imperfect, beautiful moment, was everything he'd been searching for without even knowing it. Years passed slowly, but the weight of what they had endured began to fade into something softer, like an old scar that no longer hurt when touched. The city moved on from the headlines, and Nathan's name eventually stopped appearing in the news. He had stepped down from his position as CEO 2 years after adopting Lily, selling most of his shares and keeping only what he needed to fund the foundation they built together. The Lily project had grown beyond what anyone imagined, expanding into shelters across the country, giving children a second chance at life. But for Nathan, none of the success mattered as much as the quiet mornings that began with a small voice calling from down the hall and the sound of laughter echoing through rooms that had once been silent. Their home had changed as they had. The penthouse no longer looked like a monument to wealth but like a place where people lived. The sterile white walls had been replaced with photographs, drawings, and books. Lily's room was filled with colors and paper cranes hanging from the ceiling, each one she had folded herself. She was 10 now, tall for her age, full of questions and stories that she never stopped telling. Nathan still caught himself sometimes just standing in the doorway, watching her as she did her homework, and feeling something he once thought he'd never have again, peace. Every weekend, they went to the same park where they used to walk when she lived at the shelter. She liked to bring a basket with sandwiches and a blanket, insisting they have picnics even when the weather was cold. He never argued. They would sit under the same tree each time, where she would draw in her sketchbook while he read the newspaper or simply watched the world move around them. Sometimes, she would glance up from her drawing and catch him staring, and she'd grin in that knowing way of hers. "You're thinking again," she would say, and he'd laugh because she was always right. One afternoon in early spring, she brought him a new drawing. It was a picture of a small house by the sea, surrounded by sunlight and flowers. 2 figures stood in front of it, one tall, one small, holding hands. Above them, she had written, "Home, do you like it?" she asked, tilting her head. "It's beautiful," he said. "Is that us?" "Of course," she said with a smile. "You promised we'd go to the ocean one day." He blinked, realizing she was right. Years ago, in a hospital room, he had promised her that when everything was over, when they were safe, they'd see the ocean together. He'd forgotten, but she hadn't. "Then I guess it's time to keep that promise," he said. A month later, they moved into a small house on the coast. It was nothing like the glass towers Nathan had once lived in. It was quiet, filled with the sound of waves and wind, and at night, the stars seemed closer than they ever were in the city. Lily loved it immediately. She spent her mornings collecting shells on the beach and her evenings sitting by the window, drawing the sea as it changed colors with the sky. Nathan spent most of his days helping manage the foundation remotely, but he made sure to always stop working when she came running in with something new to show him. One evening, they stood together on the sand as the sun sank below the horizon. The air was warm, the light golden and soft. Lily was barefoot, her hair tangled from the wind, and she looked up at him with that same expression she'd had the day they met, trusting, curious, and somehow older than her years. "Do you ever miss your old life?" she asked suddenly. Nathan thought about it for a moment. He remembered the office towers, the expensive suits, the endless meetings, and the hollow victories. "Sometimes," he admitted, "but not in the way you think. I miss who I thought I was supposed to be. But I don't miss the man I was." "Who are you now?" she asked.